Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, I want to talk about something I see all the time in our practice, and it's one of the biggest misconceptions I see about SIBO, honestly. People are told to follow a SIBO or low FODMAP diet. They feel better, and then they just stay on it, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. And while a therapeutic diet can be incredibly helpful, they were never meant to be the finish line. So today I want to talk about why this happens, why it can actually hold your gut back over time, and what should happen instead. One of the biggest misconceptions about SIBO starts almost immediately after someone is diagnosed. If they're lucky, they're handed a low FODMAP diet or told to search for a SIBO diet online. I say if they're lucky because I know that in many medical offices, diet is not even addressed or mentioned. So if they're lucky, they're handed a low FODMAP diet, told to search for a SIBO diet online, or maybe you do some research on your own, you come across a version online or in a book or on a blog or some other clinical resource. And I do want to be clear. I am not saying these diets are bad or wrong or that you should not use them. We actually use in our practice therapeutic diets routinely. It's often our starting point. And actually, if you go to nutritionresolution.com, I believe it's our services tab. There's a drop down that says free meal plans and guides. I mean, oh my gosh, we have a whole page of links to our different specific meal plans, and they are in depth. We have a comprehensive food list of foods to eat, foods to avoid with each plan. We have a full guide instructions as far as how to use it and nuances about it. And for each guide, we also include a 7-day, or even in the case of low FODMAP, we have a 30-day meal plan that has all the meals and snacks in a day, recipes, and even a grocery list for each week. So by no means are we strangers to these diets, and by no means are we not proponents of them. They can be incredibly helpful when they're used for the right purpose. And all of ours are free, by the way, because it's such a great starting point for people. The misunderstanding, though, is that the diets themselves are not meant to be the ultimate end all be all plan. And so we need to understand what role they're meant to play instead in the healing process. So if you're out there, and I know many of you are, and you're following one of these diets months or years later, I recognize that it's not because you want to. It's probably because this is the best you're able to feel and you don't know what else to do. But if you're still following one of these diets for that long, it's probably not what your body actually needs. This is just a mindset shift for us because we naturally think about diets as pairing it with a disease. So we think about, okay, if I have SIBO, I guess this diet is now just what I need to eat from now on. And no one really explained what role the diet is supposed to play. The misconception almost everyone walks in with is treating a SIBO diet the way they treat a diet for a more familiar condition. So think about if you have high blood pressure or high cholesterol, you go on a heart healthy diet. You eat less sodium, maybe you cut back on your saturated fat, you increase your fiber intake, and you do this because your normal diet was giving you too much of the wrong things. You know, our typical standard American diet is too high in sodium, too high in saturated fat, too low in fiber. So because of that, in part at least, we develop these conditions, high cholesterol, high blood pressure. So it makes sense that pulling back on those things is going to be the appropriate action to help improve our situation. Same with a diabetic diet. Too many refined carbs or added sugar might be in the diet, so you deliberately reduce them. The food caused the problem, so adjusting the food is the solution, or at least part of the solution. SIBO is not the same way. SIBO does not work the same way. The food did not cause the problem. And that might be a surprise for a lot of you who are maybe new to SIBO or hadn't heard that before, because I do get this question all the time. So I just want to restate that the food you're eating does not cause you to have SIBO. It's just that once you have SIBO, the food can aggravate the symptoms. So Here's where it gets a little paradoxical as well. The very foods that you're avoiding on a low FODMAP or a SIBO specific diet, the fiber, the plant foods, the fermentable carbohydrates, they're exactly the foods a healthy gut needs to stay diverse and resilient. But they're not the problem. The problem is that bacteria have overgrown somewhere where they're not supposed to be. And right now, those same healthy foods are feeding that overgrowth too, which is what's giving you the extra gas, the bloating, and the pain. So when you restrict those foods, you're not solving anything, you're just managing it. You're not killing the bacteria. You're actually not even starving them out. You're just not feeding them in the moment. And that relief is completely real and honestly completely welcome. Not being doubled over in pain, not running to the bathroom every hour. That matters and it is a real win, but it's a band-aid, not a fix. And it cuts both ways because while you're not feeding the bacteria contributing to the problem, you're also not feeding the beneficial bacteria your gut needs to recover. A diverse microbiome is consistently associated with better overall health, in part because those beneficial microbes help keep the less favorable organisms in check and contribute to a more balanced gut ecosystem. Those same fermentable foods are also what beneficial bacteria use to produce short chain fatty acids. The most well known of those is called butyrate. Butyrate is a nutrient, a short chain fatty acid that nourishes the cells lining your intestinal tract and helps maintain a strong, healthy gut barrier, which is one of the many reasons these fibers are so important once the time is right to begin expanding your diet. But when those beneficial bacteria aren't getting the fermentable fibers they depend on over a prolonged period, the microbiome can become less diverse and produce fewer of those beneficial compounds, those short chain fatty acids. And over time, that may mean less support for the intestinal barrier, fewer microbes competing with less favorable organisms, and a gut ecosystem that is less adaptable and less resilient than it could be. So, in other words, the very foods you're temporarily limiting to reduce symptoms are also some of the foods your gut eventually needs to recover and stay healthy. That's why therapeutic diets work so well as a short-term strategy, but can become counterproductive if they quietly turn into a long-term way of eating, which we see happen so often. And this is why symptom management and healing can look identical for a while, even though they're very different processes. This is the part that often gets overlooked, especially in conventional approaches where patients are frequently given a therapeutic diet, but not a roadmap for what comes next. And it's completely understandable that many people come away thinking that the diet itself is the treatment, when in reality, it's simply the first step. Its job is to calm symptoms enough that you can begin the rest of the healing process, not to become your permanent way of eating. And in our practice, we follow a structured 5-step process that guides patients from symptom relief to building a healthier, more resilient digestive system. Because you're probably wondering at this point, okay, if the diet's not the solution and it's just a band-aid, what is the solution and what is the fix? So, what we want to do is work through the different steps. The first step is symptom relief, but we work through different phases. And then the final step is rebuilding that healthy and more resilient microbiome. We actually have these steps laid out on our services page at a high level, so nutritionresolution.com and our services page, but I'll kind of walk you through what they look like briefly here. So the therapeutic diet is part of step one, and we call that calming and priming the system. And that step is incredibly important because reducing symptoms creates that stability that you need to move forward. From there, we identify what's driving the problem. So in the SIBO conversation, that might be SIBO. It could be other things if we're talking about other gut issues, or it can be a combination of things because very often there's more than one thing going on in any gut. So we identify what the drivers are, and then we work on rebalancing the microbiome. If we're talking about SIBO, that may mean clearing an overgrowth. If we're talking about something else, large intestinal microbiome issues, we would be addressing those. We're also addressing anything else that's going on, whether it's digestive, nervous system, motility related, other things. And then we repair and rebuild the gut environment. And that's also the phase where we're able to then move on to reintroducing and expanding the diet back out. Reintroducing foods at the final step is not something we do just because enough time has passed on a restrictive diet. It's something we work toward after we've addressed the things that were making the foods difficult to tolerate in the first place. So those middle steps are what help create a digestive system that's actually ready to begin expanding foods again. And this is my passion because this is what got me into all of this functional health world. Because when I first learned about gut health about 12 years ago and started doing this with patients, the low FODMAP process, when you're taught it, there's three phases. There's elimination, then there's reintroduction, and then there's personalization. Oh, and the elimination is like 2 to 6 weeks. So it kind of makes it seem like, okay, if you spend 2 to 6 weeks in elimination, that just maybe, and nothing else is said to be done, definitely nothing about root causes or anything. It kind of makes it seem like, well, just being on the diet for that time allows you to then reintroduce. But what I found was my patients would reintroduce and they would just react to everything. Nothing had changed in their guts. They just had to stay on the elimination phase. And the low FODMAP diet, they do not advise you to stay in the elimination phase. And yet that's where people get stuck because it's the best they've ever been able to feel with their condition. And so that's why I'm so passionate about doing the work. And I was passionate about finding the solution. What do we have to do to regain that resilience, to start to successfully expand the diet and tolerate those FODMAPs and those carbs and those fibers again? And that's what our program is built around. The steps build on one another. And when they're approached in the right order, the therapeutic diet becomes exactly what it was meant to be, the foundation for healing, but not the destination. And when people never move beyond step one, that's when we start seeing the unintended consequences of long term restriction. When symptom management becomes the long term plan, the changes tend to happen gradually and are easy to miss at first. Food variety often starts to shrink over time, not because people are intentionally restricting more, but more what I see is there's uncertainty that builds around reintroductions. And I noticed, gosh, almost always that the short list of foods people are eating, that there's actually more foods they would be able to eat, but because they're so unsure what they can eat and what they can't, they just stick with those state foods. So they're actually over restricting themselves out of uncertainty. And this is one of the ways we see a person's food list just whittled down and down and down over time. When a food causes symptoms or feels unpredictable, it becomes very natural to just remove it and stick with what feels safe, especially when life is busy or when someone is just tired of dealing with it, dealing with symptoms, dealing with trying to figure it out all day, every day. The easiest path is usually the most familiar one. Over time, that leads to a narrowing of the diet that isn't necessarily intentional. Most people assume they only have a handful of safe foods, when in reality, there are often many more foods they could tolerate. They just haven't tested them in a long time. So, alongside this, research has shown that long term dietary restriction is associated with reduced microbial diversity and lower production of those beneficial short chain fatty acids that we talked about. And this does lead the gut to become less adaptable and reinforces the cycle of relying on an increasingly narrow range of foods. And at the same time, food related anxiety starts to grow often. After enough unpredictable reactions, it's natural to become more hesitant about trying new foods, which can lead to more hypervigilance around meals, more hesitation with reintroduction, and just a growing sense that eating safely requires a very controlled environment. And this can also extend beyond the gut itself because in order to control that environment, eating out becomes less appealing, social situations get more complicated, and food decisions start to take up more mental space than most people realize. And even outside of symptoms, the experience of eating can start to feel narrower and more, just way more effort. What we often end up seeing is a gut that feels stable, but only under very controlled conditions. And this is where a very important distinction becomes useful. A gut can become very stable without actually becoming resilient. Many people unknowingly end up with a digestive system that behaves this way. It feels fine as long as the diet stays consistent, the environment is predictable, and nothing challenges that balance. On the surface, everything appears to be working well, but only because the conditions are so tightly controlled. I often think about one patient that really stood out to me was a perfect example of this because one of the hallmark symptoms of SIBO is bloating. So when I'm first evaluating someone, I'll usually ask about bloating pretty early in the process because it helps me guide both my clinical thinking and what kind of testing might make sense next. And I remember asking one patient if she experienced bloating, and she told me no. I don't really experience bloating. And that answer caught me off guard because I was expecting bloating to be one of her biggest complaints because everything else about her picture pointed to me suspecting SIBO in her case. So I dug a little deeper and asked what her day-to-day diet looked like. And she told me she was mostly eating chicken and rice. Very simple, very consistent, and very controlled. So I was like, okay, well, what would happen if you ate more normally? Like, what would happen if you just ate whatever you wanted? And without hesitation, she was like, oh, I would definitely get super bloated. So this is what I mean. She wasn't someone who didn't experience bloating. She was someone who had learned to prevent it by keeping every variable in her diet as controlled as possible. Her digestive system may have looked stable on the surface, but only because the conditions never really changed. It functions well when everything is predictable, but that isn't how life really works. Real life involves restaurants, vacations, holidays, stressful periods, and meals that don't always go according to plan. So, our goal is not just to have good days when all your ducks happen to be in a row. It's to build a digestive system that can tolerate more variation without everything falling apart. And that's what resilience looks like. One of the biggest shifts I hope our patients make is changing how they measure progress. When you've been dealing with SIBO for a long time, it's easy to judge every day by asking one question. What did my symptoms look like today? How many symptoms did I have today? Well, that's certainly important. It does not tell the whole story. If symptom reduction is the only measure of success, it's easy to mistake successful management for a true actual healing. So instead of just asking yourself about your symptoms, I encourage people to start asking a different set of questions. Is my food list getting bigger or is it getting smaller? Am I less afraid to try new foods than I was 6 months ago? Can I eat at a restaurant without stress or planning? Or can I eat at a restaurant with less stress or planning would be progress? Can I travel without worrying about every single meal? Do I spend less time thinking about food and symptoms throughout the day? Am I becoming more flexible when life doesn't go according to plan? Is my life getting bigger or has it become smaller because of my gut? These are signs that your digestive system isn't just becoming quieter, it's becoming more adaptable. These are things that reflect a life that's expanding instead of shrinking, which is ultimately what most people are looking for in the first place. One of my favorite ways to think about it is this. Real healing should not just make your symptoms smaller, it should eventually make your world bigger. That doesn't mean you wake up one day able to eat anything you want without any consequences. Healing is not all or nothing, and every person has a different starting point. What it does mean is that over time, your world should become less restricted. Your food choices should gradually expand. Eating should require less planning and mental energy, and your digestive system should become more adaptable instead of more dependent on perfect conditions. If you've been avoiding foods for months or years, it probably isn't because you enjoy having a restricted diet, right? More often, it's because you've worked so hard to get your symptoms under control that the thought of triggering them again feels incredibly risky. That fear is definitely understandable. If every time you've tried to branch out in the past, you've ended up bloated, uncomfortable, or tied to the bathroom, it's only natural to become more cautious about trying new foods. The good news is that rebuilding food tolerance, it does not mean just randomly eating foods and hoping for the best. It really should be a structured, strategic, and individualized process that helps you make informed decisions instead of relying on trial and error. One of the biggest mistakes we see is people making permanent decisions based on a single meal or a single day of symptoms. The reality is that symptoms don't always tell the whole story, and one uncomfortable meal doesn't necessarily mean you failed a food challenge or that a food has to come off of your list forever. This is one of the reasons we've started in our practice incorporating at-home breath testing into our food reintroduction process. So this is a device that you own, and you can actually use it not just to test and measure for bacterial overgrowth, but to measure fermentation after you eat and measure the fermentation of different FODMAPs. So with that, we can add another layer of information beyond just symptoms alone. And that helps us to better understand whether a food is truly leading to excessive fermentation or whether a temporary symptom may have another explanation. That doesn't mean that symptoms no longer matter. They absolutely do. But when you combine how you're feeling with objective information about what's happening in your gut after you eat, food reintroductions become much less about guessing and much more about recognizing patterns over time. We found that this not only helps us make better clinical decisions, but also helps patients feel more confident during the process. So instead of wondering whether every symptom means they should eliminate another food, they have a more complete picture to guide their decisions. And on top of that, we don't have people start with a full portion of a risky food. We start really small, and as long as that goes well, we can build up over time, especially when food fear is at play and that anxiety is there over what will happen. So ultimately, the goal is not simply to help you eat more foods, it's to help you also rebuild that trust in your gut so that you can make food choices feeling confident instead of feeling fear. I remember one patient who came to us, she was carrying what she jokingly called her emergency food bag. No matter where she went, she packed enough safe food to get through the day because she never knew where she'd end up or if she would end up somewhere without something she felt she could eat. She had turned down weekend trips with friends, work lunches, and she just couldn't remember the last time she went out to dinner without studying the menu online for days in advance. When we first met, she just wanted to stop bloating. That was her goal. And as we worked together, though, something interesting started to happen. The updates she shared with me became less about her symptoms and more about her life. She would tell me we went away for the weekend and I didn't have to pack every meal, or I actually enjoyed my niece's birthday party instead of worrying about food the whole time. A few months later, she mentioned that she had gone out for a date night with her husband and realized afterward that she hadn't spent the entire night thinking about her stomach. And another time, she told me she'd cooked a meal, one single meal for her whole family instead of making a separate, safe version for herself. And those moments may sound small, but they represented something much bigger than eating a wider variety of foods. They meant she was beginning to trust her gut again instead of organizing her life around it. And that's ultimately what food freedom feels like. It's not about eating everything without ever having symptoms again. It's about getting to say yes to vacations, birthday dinners, spontaneous plans, and everyday moments without your digestive system making every decision for you. Therapeutic diets can be incredibly helpful, especially in the early stages of healing when your symptoms feel overwhelming and predictable. They can provide such needed relief and create that stability needed to begin moving forward. The key is remembering that for most people, they were never meant to be the finish line. Healing has different phases, and if all your energy stays focused on avoiding symptoms forever, it's easy to miss the opportunity to rebuild confidence, resilience, and flexibility. As much as possible, the goal should be to gradually regain flexibility, confidence, and freedom, not to continue shrinking it. And that doesn't mean eating everything or ignoring your body's signals. It means working toward a digestive system that is more resilient, more adaptable, and better able to handle the normal ups and downs of everyday life. So, as you continue your healing journey, I'd encourage you to think about progress a little differently. Don't measure healing by how many foods you've eliminated. Measure it by how much freedom you've regained. If you've been stuck just carefully managing your symptoms, but you're not sure how to safely start expanding your diet, you're definitely not alone. This is one of the biggest gaps we see in SIBO care. Many people are taught how to eliminate foods, but very few are taught how to thoughtfully and confidently add them back. And I would also say that if you think you've addressed your gut issues, maybe you've been given a round of rifaximin for SIBO, or maybe even a few rounds over the years, and you feel like you've been treated and therefore you fixed your gut issues, but you're still on a very limited food list, there's more work to do. So that is one of your biggest indicators that you still have a problem. And in the case of SIBO, it's very likely that you either still have the SIBO or it's relapsed. It was never fully cleared in the first place. So that's one of the things we see the most commonly. So I also wanted to mention that when we do fully clear the SIBO and we address the gut comprehensively, that's when we see FODMAP tolerance and carbohydrate tolerance and fiber tolerance improve significantly so that the diet does not have to be so restricted. So when we see, if you're still very sensitive to foods, you likely still have that going on, and it would be worth evaluating. Because this topic today is about therapeutic diets not being the end all be all, and getting to a diverse diet is the ultimate goal. What happens in between, we touched on, but we do have a full masterclass that goes into much more depth on that process. It's free, and I walk you through the framework we use to help patients move beyond just symptom management, beyond just that therapeutic diet, and toward a more resilient digestive system. And in that masterclass, we talk about why so many people get stuck in long-term restriction, what phase two of healing actually looks like, and how we help people approach food reintroductions in a structured, individualized way instead of relying on guesswork. So if you're ready to get into depth about that more, go ahead and give that a listen. We'll include that in the show notes. All right, guys, thanks for listening. That's your gut check for this week. Come back next week for your next gut check.